Hi everyone, thank you so much for joining us today for our webinar, Employee Engagement versus Employee Happiness. Nic Marks, our Friday Pulse CEO and founder and happiness expert, is going to take us through the slides, and then we'll have some Q&A at the end. And I think Nic's also up for questions as we go through as well.
Thanks so much, Andrew. Can you hear me fine?
Yeah.
I always get nervous at the beginning here. And Charlie, no, we can't see you. I can see you in the chat there. Nice to see you're here, Charlie. I know, Charlie. I'm going to talk today about employee engagement and employee happiness, and why happiness is a winning strategy. And let's just get going. Sorry, there we go. I just want to say a little bit about who I am. So I'm Nic Marks. I'm the CEO of Friday Pulse. And this is a bit about me. I did a long time ago mathematics and then statistics and system thinking at Cambridge and then Lancaster. I thought I was a mathematician, but I turned out to be an applied statistician. I did lots of quality of life studies, worked a bit as a management consultant, then I did a master's in organizational change. I also trained as a therapist, which kind of gives me this sort of quirky mix. And I became a parent in the 90s. And then in 2000s, I founded what became the Centre for Wellbeing at the New Economics Foundation, a think tank in London. Had a very somewhat unexpectedly successful decade there, creating things like the Happy Planet Index, the 5 Ways to Wellbeing. And then in 2010, I did my TED Talk, which is about all of that work around policy. And I founded this business, which became known as Friday Pulse. And then we actually launched the product platform Friday Pulse, well, actually 2019, but basically 2020s, as that's what we're doing with that. So that's just an intro to me. So today we're going to talk about happiness and engagement and what's the difference, and clearly why I think happiness is the winning strategy. But I'm going to talk about what the key differences are, how they're measured, particularly, I'm a statistician, particularly going to go in there about the difference between drivers and outcomes, and then why happiness is a winning strategy. And then we'll have time for questions at the end. As Angela said, you can type a question in the chat. I am going to ask you some questions. So in the chat, I'm going to ask you a couple of things as we go along. And in fact, right now. So when I say engagement, what do you think of when you say that? What does engagement, employee engagement, mean to you? If you could just put some answers into the chat there, that would be reassuring that there are people out there. But when you hear employee engagement, what do you think it means? I'm going to give you a minute or two to there. So connection, participating, involvement in companies' activities, connected with their work, two-way conversations, collaboration, communication, invested, identity, there's lots going, tension, belonging, two-way dialogue. This is great. Care about their work, connected with their work, everything other than pay, understanding what's needed, active listening, understanding the big picture. Brilliant. Lots and lots of answers there. Passion. So there's lots of things that you were talking about in that. And in some ways, you know, this is an interesting thing about exchange of ideas, social. The interesting thing about the word engagement is it's sort of quite a broad thing. And actually, it was a phrase, I don't know if you know, it was first coined in 1990 by a US academic called William Kahn in a paper. And so in the work context, it's only been used quite recently. And by just less than 20 years later, there was a review in the UK called Engaging for Success, called the McLeod Review. And they found over 50 different definitions of engagement. Now, to me, that's a little problematic as a statistician. It's lots of different definitions. Do we know what it means? But anyway, that's what there is. And Gallup are the most well-known advocates. They do their State of the World report into engagement and other things. But there are literally thousands, probably tens of thousands of engagement consultants out there. Perhaps some of you even are. So definitely with the larger consultancies, they all have their own measures of what engagement is. And I'm going to go into that a little bit. But here, firstly, is Gallup's definition of engagement. And they call it the involvement and enthusiasm of employees in their work and workplace. Employee engagement helps you measure and manage employees' perspectives on the crucial elements of your workplace culture. And so, well, they've got lots of words in there. So they're defining engagement, but then they do other words: involvement, enthusiasm, perspective, culture, which are not necessarily well defined themselves. So you've sort of got these layers of uncertainty about exactly what it means. So that's a little problematic, I think. Probably the most popular recent definition comes from Utrecht University. I don't know if that's how you say Utrecht. I don't know. Anyway, I'm afraid I'm not very good at German. Or is it Dutch even? Probably it's Dutch. They talk about it as a state of mind in which, rather than being burnt out, so comparing it to being burnt out, it's Dutch. Thank you very much for that reminder. I think I've been there. I think I've done a talk there once. They talk about it as being burnt out. So it's about vigor, dedication, and absorption. Vigor, dedication, and absorption. So 3 things underneath it, right? At least it's a little bit more defined. It's a little bit more defined in people's behavior and their experience, right? You know, so it's, you know, a little bit easier. The CIPD fact sheet is there. Which talks about their work a little bit more as well. I'm sure Angela can pop in the reference to that. But you look at this, firstly, it says a state of mind. What is a state of mind? In the sense that a state to me comes across as static. And if I think about engagement, and particularly into happiness, I think of it as very dynamic, ebbing and flowing. And this seems to be saying something a little bit more static in some ways. Okay, obviously all these things move a little bit, but when you start thinking about it, they're a little bit, you know, slippery to actually really get hold of. Now, what does happiness mean to you? I'm not saying happiness is not it's not a slippery thing too. So if you could jot in there, what does happiness mean to you? Okay, Charlie, good point. Their definition says engagement and burnout is mutually exclusive. I'm not sure that is true. Joy for life, feeling contented, fulfillment, joy, contentment, overall well-being and contented, positive feeling about life, meaning and purpose, achieving life purpose, feeling alive, content with the current state, in the moment, enthusiastic about life, grateful, joy, fulfillment, connection, fun, feeling satisfied and content, acceptance, joy, grateful, competency or something, connectedness. You've got some DC Ryan in there. Self-determination theory, perfect description of it. Sense of well-being, gratitude, positive feeling and outlook, congruent, no worries. It sounds good in Jamaican there. Freedom from stress. Lots of ideas here. Awareness of positive feelings. So again, quite broad, but they're much more in the feeling moment here. And so if we think about that, engagement was coined in the 1990. Happiness is probably first coined in ancient Greek times, you know, and actually the person or people who talked about pleasure and meaning is really, that's a long threaded philosophical idea about whether you're hedonic or eudaimonic. Could be one way of thinking of it, but there's all sorts of people who, Epicurus talked about pleasure, but he was actually talking about quite meaningful pleasure. But this has been around for a long time, the idea of what's a life well lived, what's a good life, what's a happy life. It's there a lot. It also, Darwin, you know, talked about happiness as being one of the primary emotions. It's sort of forgotten that Darwin talked about emotions, but he saw them across species. So he thought about them as having, you know, evolutionary functionality, which of course is very, very true. So it's a much longer idea. It started to get increasing academic attention since the 1960s. So Richard Easterlin started to do the Easterlin paradox when he was looking at populations. It went into the US General Household Survey in the 60s, a question about happiness. And then through the 70s, started to be a bit of academic research about it, though one of the greats of happiness research, Ed Diener, the late great Ed Diener, he died last year or the year before, he found it very difficult to do a PhD on the happiness of farmers in the 1970s. He had to change it to subjective well-being to get it through the board that he wanted to talk about it. And other people, I think, have had similar stories of having to change the name to do the work they wanted to do. But it has increasingly got traction. Obviously, positive psychology has done absolutely masses with that more recently. But at its heart, you know, going back to Darwin, particularly the work of Paul Ekman in the 1960s, that happiness was considered one of the universal primary emotions. Now, I put theory in brackets. I should actually put hypothesis or categorization, because this is not how the neuroscience precisely works, but it's a useful categorization, which is they talk about there being a set of emotions such as anger, fear, sadness, happiness, sometimes called joy, disgust, surprise. And Paul Ekman in the 1960s did this with faces. And if you've seen the movie, Pixar movie Inside Out, it's basically the premise of Inside Out, that there's a girl, Riley, she's got these different emotions in her head, and there's a journey between joy and sadness. Actually, really smart that they chose joy and sadness to go together. And I just read recently, there's a very good book out, and I'm not going to remember the author right now, but someone might do, called Bittersweet, Susan Cain or something like that. Anyway, and she talks about actually a story I hadn't heard before, which was that Pixar first of all started out as a journey between fear and happiness, and then they realized it didn't work as a movie, and they had to change it to sadness. And the reason is that sadness is kind of well, the poet Kyle Gibran calls it, our sorrow is our joy remembered, that there's a connection between our sadness and our happiness. Sadness is about a loss. And in fact, the functionality of these emotions is different. The so-called negative emotions, negative not because they're dysfunctional, of anger, fear, and sadness and others, is they're called negative because they're dealing with threats in lots of ways. And they're really to avoid helping the threat come back. So doesn't necessarily mean you avoid the situation, because actually anger, we sometimes step forward to the situation. So we're challenging it. Fear would be running away, it could be freezing, all sorts of things. Susan Cain, I was right, thank you. Anyway, so you're trying to stop something happening. Whereas happiness, joy, is really saying carry on or approach it, you know. And if we think about survival and thriving, then basically the negative emotions are more about helping us survive, and the positive emotions are about how do we create and seize opportunities. And I've already started to use the word positive emotions there, which you use in your definitions, you use quite freely. And definitely that came up there, which I was pleased to see, was words like joy, so I'm going to cough, joy and contentment. So some people talked about happiness there being contentment, some about joy. Well, they're clearly quite different emotions, and we're using the word as a catch-all for these gateway to positive emotions. But, you know, there's lots in between. You know, we can write masses of lists here. I've seen lists of 86 or 102 positive emotions, but here's just some of them. Things like amusement, gratitude, enthusiasm, eagerness, interest, curiosity. These are different energies of emotion. But the word happiness opens the gateway to all of them. And they're also highly functional. So emotions, the clue is in the word, they're there to help motivate us. Which, if we go back to the core reason, and actually that first paper by William Kahn, he was talking about what motivates people at work, as well. He was interested in engagement. And emotions, and motivate, they are all about how we move in the world, and they give us energy. So, and I mean, this is just me just writing the sort of energies that I sort of see them as doing, but contentment and satisfaction, you can go into other emotions such as serenity there, peacefulness, all sorts of things are about reflecting, restoring ourselves. Gratitude, amusement, even into affiliation, into love, are about bonding and connecting with people. Enthusiasm, eagerness, maybe even engagement, but, you know, it's about mobilizing and shaping what's going on, you know, being involved. Curiosity is about exploring. Interest is about focusing. If any of you are familiar with Barbara Fredrickson's theory of broaden and build, a critique of it's generally right, but there are specific positive emotions such as interest. When you don't broaden, you narrow when you're interested. So there's complexity to what them on. And then you get joy and awe and wonder, you know, when you're sort of becoming one, or you're reaching up for things. So how, in a way, awe will help you reset your goals. So you're reaching for higher goals. So you can see that there's sort of a hierarchy of energy in some ways, and also just different types of energies, different flavors of energies there. So it's it's a beautiful array of stuff in positive emotions behind the word happiness. But when we talk about being happy at work, we're really opening the space to all of these energies, not necessarily in equal amounts, not always necessarily at the same time, but we're opening a space. If you're running a happy team, there's some time which is about bonding and connecting. There's some time about reflecting. There's sometimes about focusing. You know, I think all of us know that when we work, working from home has sometimes been quite good for focusing because we've got no distractions, but we've lost the bonding, the connecting, maybe even sometimes the reaching, the awe-inspiring bits. So there's different energies that are going on in our teams and in our lives and in our happiness at work. So it's a very rich word. And I want to go into measurement. And this is particularly, engagement, as I said, it can also be considered a broad word. And looking again at Gallup's definition, involvement, enthusiasm, these are not bad things at all. I think I really get into the problem with it when we look at the measurement of it. And so Gallup obviously are kind of, you can call it the gold standard. It's certainly the definitive one, the one that's most known about it. And they have a Q12 questionnaire, which some of you may be familiar with, but this is their questionnaire. I'm not really expecting you to read all of the questions, but I know what's expected of me. At work, my opinions seem to count. These are not engagement. These are what could be called drivers of engagement or behaviors associated with engagement, but they're sort of, cultural factors, not really engagement. And I have a real problem with this questionnaire around timeframes, in that question 3 asks about every day, question 4 about in the last 7 days, question 11 in the last 6 months, 12 this last year. And it's like, what are you talking about to me here? Are you talking about my last week? Are you talking about my day to day? Are you talking about my year? They're very different things. And so it really only sort of lends itself to a once a year survey, or once every 6 month survey. And it's very, very bitty. And there's no sort of understanding about the weights of the different questions, which are the most important to us. To be fair to Gallup, I think, they feel very atheoretical. But if you put a sort of Maslow sort of lens on it, you could say this, and I've got no idea about how they define these questions, but you could say the first 2 about basic needs, the next 4 about supportive needs, and then you've got your belonging needs and your growth needs. And so there's, there could be some theory underneath it, but they're not very transparent about how they've chosen these questions. They're not very transparent how they get to the figure that only 13% of the world's population are engaged. I'm assuming that they've got some big bell curve, some big normal distribution, and they do a cutoff somewhere and they say this is engaged and this isn't. But it's a little bit arbitrary in that sense. So I just got to get back to my page. There we go. Sorry. So I still can't say it, but Utrecht, it reminds me of any sort of Last Kingdom. Utrecht was the hero in Last Kingdom. Anyway, they're 3-facet definitions. So a state of mind is about vigor, dedication, and absorption, and they have created scales that do this in a typically good psychometric way. I think they started with an 18-item questionnaire, and they've actually got down to a pretty good three question scale. At my work, I feel bursting with energy. I am enthusiastic about my job. I'm immersed in my job. So vigor, dedication, absorption. But, even with this, I don't certainly think of energy bursting at work. I don't know, probably I could answer the question, but I could probably ask if I'm immersed in my job. If I'm looking at I'm a statistician, so if it's a spreadsheet, I'm going to get very observed it, or if I'm writing a talk, I am. But, could you ask a van driver that, someone that works on the shop floor, would it make sense to them? It's a little bit difficult to know. It feels a little white collar to me. It doesn't feel very inclusive, still feels very academic-y. I don't really totally connect with it. I certainly don't connect with the word engagement. As a employee, when someone is asking me about engagement, it kind of just feels like you're trying to get more out of me for the same money. So there's a sort of feeling that it's really a code word for productivity. you're using here. You're dressing it up in nice management speak, but it's like, doesn't really feel a good, strong pact with me. So I sort of slightly worry about these questions, and you know, but there's very good academic work about it. I think that I've got a reference for you, Angela, to post in there, but you know, it correlates positively with job satisfaction, negatively with boredom and burnout, but it does also slightly positively correlate to workaholism, you know, and there is, I think, there's different timescales. So when you're burnt out, you're actually burnt out. But in the prelude to that, you're probably highly engaged. In the sense, if you don't really care about your work and you're disengaged, you're unlikely to go that far that you get so stressed. So there's some ways that these things are. I'm not saying that happiness doesn't sometimes have that too, but basically it's, you know, it's a little bit not quite sure. So, and I think the major problem, this is really my point about understanding the difference between drivers and outcomes. But if I ask you this question, how engaged are you at work? From not at all to completely. I don't know, this audience, you might be able to answer that question. I don't know, you can put your opinions in the chat if you want to. But I think it's a little bit difficult to say what the top of the scale is. What does completely engaged mean? Does that mean I have to be available 24/7? And we're a particular audience, so we kind of know what engaged is. Yeah, I can see you're giving me answers, lots of fours there. I primed you by ticking the four, so I've really disrupted the survey. Apologies for that. Yeah. So, but if you're someone's, you know, delivering you something, could they answer that question? It feels, again, very white collar, very, you know, I don't know. I think it's really difficult to know what fully engaged is. But just to say, I think this is a much easier question to answer. How happy are you at work? If you're asking this general way, you probably put in the front, in general, how happy are you at work? But it's sort of more the language of people. You know, people will ask you whether you're happy at work or not. You know, how's your work going? You know, are you happy? You know, it's how we talk to each other. And so it's much more inclusive. You know, you can ask, I always laugh when I come to say this line because someone wrote it for me, but from the shop floor to the top floor, they wrote. But, you know, basically any type of job, you can answer this question. It's easy to give an answer. Now, it's particularly easy to give an answer and much easier when I change it to this question. How happy were you at work this week? That's a very easy question to answer. It's time frame. So, you know, we don't have that problem that the Gallup Q12 had, where they had lots and lots of different time frames they're asking about. This week, how was I? In a way, it's also respectful because, as someone wrote earlier, it depends, you know, and we have good and bad weeks. That is just life, you know. In fact, we're not going to be happy all of the time. It might even be dysfunctional to be happy all of the time. Yeah, in that, you know, you're missing negative signals. We naturally, you know, it naturally ebbs and flows. You know, you probably have 3 moods in a morning. Good and bad days, good and bad weeks. And if you're as old as me, you get good and bad decades. You know, life moves in waves. And I would strongly suggest that you don't think of happiness, go back to that phrase that Utrecht University said, still don't know if it's Utrecht, anyway, said which is, it's a state of mind. No, it's very dynamic. It's very flowing, moving. It's like water. It's like a wave. It's going up and down. And I want to show you data on this and what I mean, and how suddenly data comes alive when you look at things this way, which is the pandemic. Okay, we've all been through it, and we're all here. And we've talked a lot over the last couple of years of waves of COVID cases, waves of hospitalization, waves of deaths even. And we've been used to seeing those time series graphs. But I'd hazard a guess that most of you haven't seen a graph of the impact of pandemic on happiness and employee happiness. Yeah. This came out in about a year ago. It was in the World Happiness Report 2021, in chapter 7, buried away in chapter 7. And it was the impact of COVID on UK workers' weekly happiness during COVID. And you can see basically a negative curve, a negative reflection of what was happening with COVID. So, here in March 2020, we see the huge dip, when we started seeing things happening. If you can remember back to that time, so I was in London and the beginning of the week, it was pretty normal. And then suddenly by the end of the week, this is before Boris locked us all down, the tubes are emptying. It was really scary. I remember one of the big 4 accountancy firms, the 1st of March, suddenly did a work from home day to just test their systems. And I thought they were overreacting. Or I think lots of us did, So, but actually, we 2 weeks later, we were working from home. There was this adjustment as we got used to it. We had the, raising in the summer, we had the eat out to help out. And then we had drops in the autumn as COVID started to rear its ugly head again. But the impact on happiness, weekly happiness, was sort of the inverse. And I'm just really pointing out that you need to measure weekly to see this curve. I mean, you could do it daily if you wanted to, but that's a little bit too granular. But weekly is sort of an ideal measure. It's sort of, cuts life into good, nice chunks, and particularly at work when we work in a weekly sprint. Yeah. So, and this data, as I said, was available in the World Happiness Report. Is actually, source of it is from YouGov, the Mood of the Nation. And this is, you can actually download the data from the website. So this is me downloading their data for a longer period of time. It's exactly the same data. It's just all UK white collar. The dip, the first dip, the rise up with eat out to help out, the drop. This is Christmas. Oh, sorry about my scale down there. It's suddenly gone wrong, but that's Christmas 2020. So although we were locked down, it was a bit happier. Rising, I personally found this period the hardest in the January, February, and then rising and bumbling along up. Now, the YouGov question wasn't precisely the same as what we ask our clients, because we use a 5-point scale. This was happy or not. So I rebased them. So we can't, I've got a big hunch that our clients are happier than national average, but probably got good evidence of it, but I'm not taking that for granted. I'm just following the shapes of the curves. But this was the shape of the curve for all our clients. And so you see the same dip before, and then a rising up, and then really interestingly, no second and third dips. You'll have to answer that question whether you're going to send something, Angela. So the rising up, but these second and third dips not being there is a classic symptom of resilience, in the sense that here is resilience, it's bounce back, which is one type of resilience, but another type of resilience is absorption, not letting the shocks of the outside world in. And our clients have done a great job of doing that. They were, though, measuring the data every week. So they were thinking about it every week, and they were no doubt doing things about it. So if they did start to dip, they'd start to react to it quicker, I would presume. There's a difference also in that this first dip was driven very much by fear, as in scaredness. The second and third dips were massively driven by boredom, of being locked down and of working from home and things like that. So it might be that our clients were doing a much better job of not helping their employees get bored, but that was what was going on there. So the weekly data allows you to see these sort of things. So that's very important. So, but we do want to know how people are feeling every week, but we also want to know about what's driving that. So in a way, you can think of the Gallup Q12 as drivers of it. So this is the way that we think about it at Friday Pulse, which is that there are basically 5 ways to happiness at work, which is connect, our relationships, being fair, the system is just, empowering people, challenging them, and inspiring them. I don't want to claim this as new science. You can look at the top end of that, empower, challenge, inspire. You can see Daniel Pink's drive. He also based his very much on self-determination theory, which is what someone mentioned when they thought of happiness. Just as a typical thing, I would say that North Americans are less good at thinking about system effects. They tend to think more individually. So these two on the left are much more systemic. So the fairness is about, the balance between your life and outside, how whether you're treated with respect and fairness. And then the connect one is obviously about relationships. So you could think about them again as Maslow. You'd have to put the be fair at the bottom of the pyramid, but it kind of works. And there is a reason that we've chosen these, not just because they're nice names, but what it basically was that if you look at these sort of emotions and you look at the sort of energies that they are releasing, that they roughly, not one-to-one, but they roughly relate to these. You know, when you know, in a sense, you feel content when things, you know, aren't bad. You know, that they're going okay, that they're treated fairly. Then you've got the connection ones, the empower, the challenge, and inspire. So again, it's this array of experiences going on, and you're trying to capture that breadth of the things that lead into happiness. Now, that's a theoretical model of why we've chosen those, but there's also a totally empirical one. And in 2016, 2017, my company used to be called Happiness Works. We worked with the recruitment agency Robert Half on a big international survey looking at what made for happiness at work. And we actually surveyed 22,000 people. I say we did, they did. I designed the questionnaire. They paid for it. That was a joy. But I had 30 questions on people's experience of work. So the typical way that you create a shorter scale questionnaire is that you start with a longer one and then you cut it down and you cut it down. So there is an absolute tension between breadth of drivers and a length of the questionnaire. It's why sometimes you get these hugely long questionnaires because everyone wants every angle. You actually, when you do very long questionnaires, you get less and less good quality data the further down the questionnaire you go, because people get tired. Yeah, and so they don't give you as good answers. They start going 3, 4, 3, 4, 3, 4 because they've got bored. So you have a real challenge there as a survey designer between wanting everything that you think you want and actually being very pragmatic about it. But that meant I was able to look at, you know, what are the best questions for it. So these were the ones we came up with, which if any of you have, any of our clients, you'll have used this. We call it a culture profile, the 5 ways to happiness, but there's 15 questions that we use. 3 sitting under each of these. The reason it's 3 is that's the shortish psychometrically robust scale. So there's basically a connect scale, a be fair scale, a power scale, challenge one, and inspire one. And again, even underneath them, you're looking for a little bit of breadth so that you get sort of different angles on the fairness. You get different angles on the empower. So you're trying to give as much, yeah, I'm a very pragmatic, applied statistician. I'm trying to give you as much data that's helpful. And I'm also trying to be on the side of respondent and not overburden them with too much. So there's this tension that goes on with it. But really what you're looking to do is to see, how do these drive happiness? It's not a very beautiful blue lines here that I've drawn today, but basically, you know, how do these connect to it? Now, the Gallup Q12, if you've just got 12 questions at the bottom, you don't know in any particular circumstance whether it's about having a best friend at work or being supervised well or given good feedback or whatever the question is. You haven't got anything to judge it against because you haven't got that outcome measure. Our outcome measure is very clear. It's how happy are you at work, or how your average happiness at works are. You know, so you can basically look at those balances, and of course that helps us choose the best questions, but it also helps provide you good information for it. And I'll give you an example from the Robert Half here, which is that we knew the levels of happiness. Actually, I've taken away the interest and stress, but we know them by different occupations. So education and training was the happiest. Hospitality, perhaps not surprising, was one of the lowest. Yeah. So so you can see those, but you're going to have different factors underneath driving them with different weights. So you can draw things. I thought I forgot I had this graph. This is basically just saying that plotting it against household income. Yes, education and training is the top, but you can see down there that, you know, that finance does surprisingly poorly compared to the income. Hospitality and fraud does poorly on both, but, you know, education and marketing, they do better than you would expect to income. So basically, there's a weak correlation between income and happiness at work. It exists, but it's weak. So I just got to get myself back on it. Right. So this is the point I was going towards forward, which was that you can look at the different weights that are doing it. So what I find fascinating about this is that for accountants, the top factor that was driving the difference between accountants on how happy they were was feeling appreciated at work. So the bean counters that are accountants, you know, need love. Yeah. Marketing, advertising is doing worthwhile work. because it's more meaning and purpose for them, because they often perhaps feel that, you know, that their work is a little soulless. I think sometimes some marketing people do. So actually, when they feel it's more soulful, I'm using that word a little bit, you know, then it becomes more important to them. You know, for others, it's the pride in the organization. But you can start addressing these different weights, which is what I mean by the difference between outcomes and drivers. So really, I've sort of gone through most of the first bit, like what are the key differences between happiness engagement, how they're measured differently. I'm obviously exceptionally biased towards measuring happiness. You know, you can challenge me in the questions, but the difference between drivers and outcomes. And I'm just going to finish off with talking about why happiness is a winning strategy. So first, I'm going to give you some evidence on retention, then productivity, and then creativity. So this is our own data, which is about looking at our clients. Actually, it's one of our largest clients. This is looking at it pre-COVID, and they had 9,000 employees. And what we were able to do was to bundle up their data. So we're looking at a Q1 and a Q2. You know, what was your happiness in Q1? Did it predict whether you left? Because basically, with our work with clients, we know someone's left because they drop out of our lists. So we know they were leaving. We don't know why they left. We just know they've left. But we can look at what predicts that. So this is the graph that we got, which is that basically the unhappy were twice as likely to leave as the happy, even more than that. And this isn't rocket science. I'm not going to win a Nobel Prize for it. But this data, if it's available to an organization, immediately starts to identify who's at risk and who isn't. And you've got this data. This is the very next quarter, don't forget. So people, when they start becoming unhappy, start thinking about leaving very quickly. This is quite a fast turnover business, by the way. And just to note here that those people that didn't respond to our survey were almost as likely to leave as the unhappy. So in a sense, even a non-response is a signal of disengagement or unhappiness going on. Can look at happiness and productivity. I'm going to talk about sales today. I've got other data on this, but I really like this study, really like the design in the study. It's a very clean study. It's about BT call centers, 1,750 operators, 11 different BT call centers across the UK. 90% of the time they were measured in, they were doing inbound calls. And what that means is there's no prospecting. They're not basically having to use their intelligence and guile to find a customer. It's just getting routed to them. So they are passively accepting a call. And they measured happiness weekly. And so they were able to look at the happiness in the week and the sales in the week. They had to look at those connections. And what they found was that happy operators made 13% more sales. In a very limited thing, there's very little, there's no teamwork. They're just working on their own. Teamwork obviously has a big impact on happiness and productivity at team levels, but this particular study, very clean. You've got the unit of measurement as the individual, the happiness as the individual, the sales as the individual. So it's very, very clean. That's why it's such a good study. There's a question here. Could that not be sales driving happiness opposed to the other way around? You're totally right, Charlie. It's not. They had this really clever design in there, which was that they looked at the weather each week. And what they basically could show was that the weather was impacting on people's happiness, and then that was impacting on the sales. Okay, so they could see the causal data. It's really beautifully parceled out. It's probably the best study on it. So that absolutely could be, but they looked at that. They found that happier operators fulfilled their schedules more completely. They worked faster, and they made better quality calls. They did all three of those things. But actually, the only thing that actually affected the sales was the better quality calls. And the happier operators were basically showing better social and negotiating skills, and they're more likely to be focused during the call. And they also had higher customer satisfaction ratings. That's not surprising. So if you're in services, it's very, very important. But, you know, notice how we're talking here very much about their soft emotional intelligence, if you want to, relationship intelligence, skills that the positivity is driving. So it was a very big effect. And they also noticed that those who became happier became more productive. In other words, if they were unhappy in week 1, their sales were lower. If they're happy in week 2, perhaps driven by the weather, they were making more sales. So they could look at that in-person effect too, which is basically how they tackled your question, Charlie. So the guy who wrote this, so Angela's put my blog about it, and in there you'll see the link to the original one, but it's by a professor called Jean-Emmanuel Deneve, who's from Oxford University, who led the study. There were other people involved too, but he's the one I know. So this is a very strong result, and also talks about the sort of skills that start emerging when you're doing happiness. I'm just looking at the time because I'm worried and my screen's not showing it. Okay, I've got a bit of time.
About 15 minutes, Nick.
Thank you. Okay, this is just a study on creativity and happiness. Again, I want to show you these soft skills that start emerging when you've got positive mood. It's a very famous experiment called the Dunker Candle experiment. You get some matches, a box of tacks, and a candle, and you ask to light the candle in such a way that when you do it, it doesn't drip. Sorry, I've got confused. I got worried about the time. You attach the candle to the wall, you then light it, and the wax has to not drip on the floor. And it's a lateral problem solving. And basically the trick is you have to notice there's a box, you empty the tacks, you put the tack on the wall, and you've solved it. But that's very easy to know when you've done it. And they basically put people into different moods, a negative mood, a positive mood, and see how they did it differently. They had a control group they did nothing to. 13% of them solved the Dunker Candle experiment in, I don't know if it's 5 or 10 minutes, but it's in limited time. They put people into negative mood. Perhaps they showed them a video of a baby screaming, which puts us on edge, or something horrible, puts you in a bad mood. 20% of people solved it, which is really quite interesting. And I think this is why sometimes, managing by anger or fear or threats sometimes works, and it agitates us, it gives us energy. So there is an effect there. But actually, when you put people in a positive mood, 75% of them solved it. 75% of them solved it. So it's a massively different effect size there. So if you're looking to have a creative, innovative, collaborative team, then that whole array of positive emotions, but getting people in a positive mood is massively important. If you're running a brainstorming, do the treats at the beginning, or do the fun thing at the beginning so everyone gets in a better mood. Don't leave it to the end. Would be another one. So there's lots and lots of ways that happiness drives lots of things. I just also want to say that if you lead a team, this is the big thing in your favor, which is that it's massively nicer to lead a happy team than an unhappy one. It's much less stress, there's less conflict, everything goes smoother. So it's very much in the team leader's self-interest to lead a happy team. Yeah, not by avoiding issues, but by tackling them. If you avoid things, they fester, they become more problematic. You may avoid a short-term conflict, but you then just create other problems. But by basically looking after the team morale every week, you build this great experience for everybody. And of course, it helps everyone meet their business goals more. Now, people often ask me, can you actually improve a team? Actually, this is just evidence from one team leader who is using our product. And you can see that when he took over this team, because he was appointed to turn around the team, the team was scoring very lowly, 46, they're now up at 75. It doesn't come overnight, but he's done it over time. So it's really possible. And really putting it into the actions, basically how we've designed Friday Pulse, is that we create data-rich feedback loops that help you build happy, productive teams, either your team, or if you look across lots of teams, all of the teams, if you're in HR or people analytics, it's how do you track that? It's basically got all of that built into it. And so it's a weekly check-in. How happy are you this week? It's a quarterly culture profile, deeper dive around the 5 ways, and it's creating predictive analytics all the way through. So this is actually a more typical trend for a team, mainly doing fine, having a setback, coming back. They know immediately that there's a setback, so they can tackle it. There is a huge, people say, basically what I suggest, by the way, is you have a weekly team meeting and you build on the positives and don't let the frustrations. Friday Pulse has a feature for that, which is basically a slide deck you get each week. We'll show you what's gone in your team last week. We don't only just measure how happy you were. We ask people, what was a success for you? Is anyone you want to thank? Have you got any frustration? So we're trying to pick up the friction and flow in the week. And people say, oh God, I'm busy. Have I got time to have a team meeting? It's so worth your time. I just released a blog last week, basically showing it's got a 5-time return on investment. It's a very simple calculation, which is that a team meeting takes about half an hour. That's about 1.25% of the working week. If you get at least 7.5% increase in productivity, you've got a 5 times return on investment straight away there. And 7.5 is a really low, at the low end. Sometimes we definitely say that happy teams compared to unhappy teams. So the guy that turned that team around, he might be having a 28%, 30% increase in productivity. Massively changes between different types of professions. The more creative, the more innovative, the less defined a job, the bigger the effect of happiness. The more repetitive, the smaller effect. Still there for the smaller ones, but it's a smaller effect. You can see that with the BT sales. That's why it's such a good one. It's not exactly the most exciting job working in a call center, but they're still getting that 13% extra sales. So this is really big return on investment going on here. The quarterly reflections, these are the questions that you do, but we create a lot of reporting for you, how all the scores are doing. We also do something which you call an impact report, which is basically the same as I showed you for those sectors, which will identify which are the ones that will most drive increases in happiness for you, your particular team. We can look at that because we've got all of the correlation coefficients between the different variables. And actually, we don't even treat them as linear variables. 1 to 5 often looks like linear. We treat them as categorical variables. They're basically different steps between each of them. So we can model each of those independently. What's the happiness benefit for moving from a 2 to a 3, from a 3 to a 4? We can look at those independently. There's just some screenshots of stuff. Basically, Friday Pulse is for the whole business. As I said, it's for the employees because basically it gives them a voice and they feel listened to. If you act on the data, if you just ask them, don't do anything with them, they're going to get annoyed very quickly. It's for senior leaders because, in HR, because it gives them, a finger on the pulse. They can actually get that frontline feedback each week. But it's also team leaders because it makes their job easier and better, helps them be a better team leader. And that's a very important feature for us, I think, ethically and morally, as well as anything else, is that sometimes team leaders can feel very exposed by surveys. They feel it's a judgment on them, but this is actually a tool that helps them, do better. You can go and check out our pricing and everything like that. There's a free team version and you can get started for free. We have white papers, which you can go to the insights page. There's one on the business case there. There's one on the 5 ways, which I've talked about that. Yeah. And it's questions now. Question time. I hope I've left some time. I've not done that presentation before, so I didn't know how long it was. So it was a little longer than I expected.
So you've got one question already in the Q&A and then a couple that have come through in the chat. Don't know if you want to. So
Neil, yeah. So is the way to happiness to be kind? I mean, happiness is so relational, Neil. I'll turn off my screen. Happiness is so relational, Neil, in that Daniel Kahneman talks about happiness almost being a social emotion. And it's very between us. We're much more likely to laugh with other people. Our mood is likely to be elevated around other people. I've lost this question now, but I think he said kindness, didn't he? Is kindness the way? Kindness is a hugely critical part in it. And in a way, it comes through lots of ways. And there's a charity I work with sometimes called Action for Happiness. They talk about creating a happier and kinder world. I think it's very, very important. Yeah, I've lost where the questions are, everything, Angela. So you're going to have to leave me.
So you've got Carly in the Q&A. Asking, what are the main drivers, motivations for your clients who sign up for Friday Pulse?
Productivity, retention, etc. I would say that we have quite a lot of clients that are scaling. So they're growing. And I think when they're growing from 50 up to 150 people, 250, 500, they very much worry about losing their culture. And so they're interested in how do they protect that? How do they do it? I think a lot of our clients are already really decent companies and they just simply care.
Yeah.
Really weirdly, I don't think the business case is what drives most of them. I think it's other things that drive them. The business case is there, but I think that drives people is just, I think, wanting to be better employers. And I think they want to shout to the rooftops that they try and run a happy ship. So I think that's their main motivation, I would say. You deal with clients a lot, Angela. Would you agree with that?
Yeah, totally. I think we have some lovely clients who really care about their people. And I think, as you were saying, it really helps them to help their managers, because it's hard being a manager sometimes, and it really helps managers to work with their teams and look after their team's happiness at work.
I'm going to come back to you in a minute, Charlie, but I really like the question below. AJ, what's most important, to look happy or feel happy? So for you to feel happy, but don't underestimate for your team that it's quite important to look happy, in the sense that if you are interacting with other people, if you look like a black hole, you suck the energy out of people. So, and sometimes, and this is obviously really hard when you lead people, sometimes you've got to work out how to set aside your own mood so that you can interact with the person in front of you. But if you genuinely feel happy, you tend to radiate it. And you just have to be careful that you're able to, I mean, if you're a team leader, sometimes there's things it's fine to talk to your team about that are stressing you. And sometimes it's better you take them somewhere else, to a mentor in the organization, to a peer group, maybe a managers meeting together, because moods are very contagious. And so, some people talk about radiators and drains, and that if someone's a radiator and they give off positive energy, my goodness, they're nicer to work with. So there is the way it works. They tend to go together, and sometimes you have to manage your moods if you're a people leader to ensure that, and just to make sure that you're not, we have this big negativity bias, and we basically look out for things not going well. So we have to watch out for that. We have to think about that. I'm going to go to Charlie's question. Right, is happiness the only employee experience measure that matters? I think it's the most important, Charlie, and I say this from a statistical perspective, in that I've done big surveys where I've got like 120 questions. I mean, I apologize to those people that I asked 120 questions to, but certainly bring it down to 80, then 40 was my sort of pathway, and then down to 15. But there is this, when you look at data, if any of you are statisticians, you'll know there's something called factor structure or factor analysis, and you basically look at the dimensions of the data. So you're looking to simplify your data by grouping things together, and there's something called an eigenvalue that is basically the measure of that. And there's always this huge eigenvalue, the first one that anything drops into, and basically it's a good bad signal, and it's at the core of every data. So I reckon, by my estimates, that if I've got a data of 40 questions, I can explain between 35 and 50% of the variance with one question, which is, are you happy or not? This is about work. I've seen in other data, I did a study on theatres once, was it about the drama in the play? Was it about the people you were with? Was it about whether it was funny? Was it about, whatever? The core of it was, did you enjoy it? Did you not? And then there were these other dimensions underneath it. So I think that you're looking for that good, bad signal. And it's my best good, bad signal I come up with is how happy it worked this week. You could ask people, how good has your week been? But then what happens is people tend to think of what they delivered straight away, rather than how it's hitting, how it's landing on them. Whereas happy immediately goes into that. So that's what I'm looking for. Has it worked for you? It tends to be what we do in the English language. So it's the strict way I measure it, how happy were you at work this week, is called episodal measurement. You get to the end of an episode, and then you look back to see what's happened. I think it's the best, and it's clearly what I'm passionate about. Are happiness and well-being interchangeable? No, not exactly. Well-being is much more nebulous, much broader, and it has probably a functional element. So when I used to run the Centre for Wellbeing, I used to say it was feeling good and doing well. There's a functional element to it, so I talk much more about it. So in a way, I think the whole of the way that we look at happiness at work at Friday Pulse is well-being, in a sense, in that we're looking at the feeling, and then we're looking at the functionality with the 5 ways, stretching it slightly, but basically, it's better. And people tend to use well-being as wellness, as physical, they use it in lots of different ways. It's also, if I asked you, how was your well-being this week? I don't believe you could answer it as easily as, were you happy? Happy is much more just, it's built in almost at a cellular level with us. Is it good? Is it bad? Do we approach? Do we avoid? It's about homeostasis in the building, in the organism, if you really want to get that technical about it. But basically, it's about approach, avoid. And so it's really, really important signal for us. I'm paraphrasing Mo Gadat. Right, I love Mo as a human being. I'm not very keen on his equation. I think it's a little simplistic, but and this goes back way below Mo to, is it Henry James? I can't quite remember his name. That one of the original psychologists in the States who talked about happiness being about expectations. It is slightly in life, but so, you know, but the problem is, if you really took that seriously, then one way to increase people's happiness is to lower their expectations. I don't think that's a very good outcome. You know, basically lower their expectations so they feel better. It's a little bit about the pleasure meaning tension that we talked about earlier, which is that, you know, meaning is more cumulative and more expressive. In a way, pleasure is what comes towards us, which is, I think, where expectations come. Meaning is a little bit more what we give out in the world, what we do for other people, how it connects us to the broader society. And I think there is very, very well articulated by Paul Dolan in a book called Happiness by Design. Though it's an ancient Greek idea, it's basically back to that hedonism and eudaimonia, but pleasure and meaning can go together, or they can be in conflict. And an example I've sometimes given from my life was that I was married. My marriage was hugely meaningful and hugely important to me. It was deeply unhappy. Eventually I snapped and I had to leave because my happiness in the day-to-day became too draining, even though I still held the vision that was very meaningful. So these things can go and you can get it exactly the opposite way. People who are too pleasure orientated, you know, that can end messily because they haven't got enough meaning. And it's about getting them both. And I don't think it's about balance. I think it's about synergy. Actually, what you really want is pleasure and meaning, and then you get the great life. If you've just got meaning, you get a bit dry. If you just get pleasure, it's a bit too wet. Up here is where the whole thing is. But that's a little bit philosophical. But so I don't think, I think it's a little simplistic to just say it's expectations. Doesn't mean to say I don't think Mo does good work and is not a great advocate for the field. I do think he is. Is there anybody left? I've talked a lot and we're nearly at the end. I don't know if questions.
There's a few questions in the chat, Nick, but we are at time. So I think probably best that we take the questions offline and respond to people. Well,
I don't mind carrying on chatting and answering these questions.
Okay, brilliant.
But also people shouldn't feel they have to stay. You know, I don't mind doing another 5 minutes if people want to. We've got Vladimir was asking, how do you make sure that the happiness score is answered honestly? Trust, you build psychological safety. You basically, we often see a shape with clients where it's a little bit higher in the first couple of weeks and then it just dips a bit, and basically they're getting more honest answers as people actually understand they're being listened to. So people will only give you good feedback if you act on the data. That's why the weekly team meeting is so important. And, you know, Angela will know this. We went through a difficult period just internally in our organization, and we had a whole company meeting about it because it's very important to us about what's going on. So, and sometimes you just have to take that space to ask those more questions about what was going on. So it's about whether you act on it. If you act on it, people are going to give you honest answers. So if not, then they just click happy just to get it out of the way. But if you talk about it every week, then it becomes much more meaningful and much better data. Yeah.
And I think that sort of answers Lauren's question as well, but maybe you want more to say on it, that is there a time when answering on the 1 to 5 scale becomes fatigued and therefore less meaningful?
This is a very difficult balance line, but basically if you want data every week, you've got to give people the option to give you 1 click and then just be done with their week. So basically the first thing you get in ours is you get this 5-point scale, and what tends to happen is people tend to get a set point. They tend to basically answer most weeks, say a 4 that they're happy, or say a 3 that they're okay. And then if they have a good week, they go up 1. If they have a bad week, they go down 1. And in a way, that's what you want, because you want it to be a signal, you know. And but the more people that respond 4 rather than 3, the team is going to function better too. So it's a balance, but basically you're looking to do that. So I think if you don't follow up in the organization, yes, that happens. And we hear about that, you know, not through our clients, but just particularly when we're presenting to other clients, how does it stay meaningful? The reason it stays meaningful is we give people immediately the option to write something about what was a success. So we go to text. And so I've basically got this good, bad signal, and then you just open into a really complex, very, very particular space. Like, you know, I've done long surveys with teams and I can ask lots of fancy questions. I still don't understand what's going on, but someone writes it, suddenly it becomes easy to understand. So we move into qualitative text data straight away, so that makes it more meaningful.
Yeah, and then reflecting on it together in the team meeting, as you were saying, that has the meaning, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Arabella is asking, is it possible to cut the data by different subsets of a large team or department? And I think that was one of the slides that you skipped over was the heat map.
Yeah, so basically the heat map we see, basically we have a thing in Friday Pulse, which is you can't see data that is less than 3 people. So we did set it originally at 5. We got too many requests from clients. Oh, there's only 4 people in this team, blah, blah, you know. So it's 3 now. The idea is if there's 2 other people, you don't really know what their score is. You can cut it any way like that. So it can be teams, and we have other filters that people can do. You know, tags basically, but it could be projects, it could be pay grades, it could be locations, all sorts of things. Yeah.
You've got another question in the Q&A. If you're asking about happiness every week, do people expect it and then become more mindful about how they're feeling on a weekly basis?
I think most certainly. I think that questionnaires, you know, I think it's what Cosmopolitan magazine discovered a long time, having a little quiz and mostly A's, B's, it helps you reflect, doesn't it? And one of the things you're trying to do with particularly the 5 ways and the 15 questions under there is make signposts towards what sort of things that generate happiness. You're trying to signal. So I sometimes talk about our data as being a mirror showing you where you are, but then also a door or a window that shows you where you can go to. And so I've forgotten the original question, but basically
asking about it every week, do people expect it and become more mindful about how they're feeling?
Actually there is evidence that people answering a question on happiness every week, not especially about work, but makes them happier because they reflect every week on what they can do to be happier. And so you are trying to help individuals. We are shaped very by our systems, but we do have lots of things under our own control. So it's both down to us and the system, and the better the fit, the better it all goes.
I'm going to mangle your name, and I'm so sorry. Shikranth. That's not going to be right, and I'm so sorry. Is there an NPS equivalent 3-question questionnaire to measure employee happiness?
So NPS, Net Promoter Score, tends to use an 11-point scale. 0 to 10, that's 11 points. They categorize people 9, 10, if that's the right end of the scale for you guys. 9, 10 as the super promoters. I think it's 6, 7, 8 as neutral, and then below 6 as detractors. I have written a blog on why I can't stand ENPS. That could maybe be another podcast, but another webinar. But there's just so many things I could say about that. I don't like 11 points. They reduce the data. It's very hard to know how different people use 9 and 10 and things like that. And then just actually the question itself asks you, would you recommend this product or with this place to work? You're asking people to put in a hypothetical future situation they don't have an experience of, whereas we ask about your experience of last week. So there's lots of things in there. There is a simplicity to it, which is very elegant, very beautiful. And we just do that as a 0 to 100 index. I don't do the little cheesy thing they do, which is have the promoters and minus the detractors and suddenly create a score. It's really statistically dodgy. You lose a lot of information in that movement to one number. It doesn't give you a better number. I'd much rather you took as a one number. We do an index, but you could say this percentage of people are happy at work this week. That would be perfectly good. So 67%. It's slightly less information than when we create an index, because basically when we create the index, we're allowing for the fact that there are 5 different scores. When you categorize it as these 2 are happy, these aren't, you've reduced that information. So you've got less variance in the data, but it's not a bad thing to do. It's not terrible. ENPS is even worse than that, because it does this minus the 1 from the 2, and you've got sorry, I hate it.
I think we ask about pride, don't we? And that's a very that's asking us about a similar kind of concept about how proud people feel to work for their organization.
Yeah, we do. And actually, I have somewhere got some data which shows how correlated happiness is to ENPS, and particularly how happiness is very how pride, organization pride is even more so. If I ever do a webinar on Net Promoter Score, maybe we should put it in the book. I'll dig out that data and present it.
Brilliant. And Graham is saying, do people have to be happy, or could satisfied work?
So in that sense, okay, so we have a 5-point scale where we go very unhappy, unhappy, okay, happy, very happy. And satisfied, if you were doing it, you tend to have very dissatisfied to very satisfied. I find satisfied a little unenergetic as a word, a bit flat. It does actually open itself more to that expectation thing, you know, satisfaction is a little bit even closer to that. And, you know, you're satisfied at work. Yeah, I'm satisfied. I don't know, it's a bit sort of dull. So I've never been very keen on satisfaction scales, so used very broadly in wellbeing work. Life satisfaction is the classic measure. So I don't think they don't work. I just don't think it's very inspiring as a word. So happiness is much more energetic. You know, I feel I can build a business around happiness at work, but, you know, building a business around satisfaction at work, I don't know, it's a bit dull. So in some ways it's language. I do think other scales could work, but in the end you have to choose one and work with it. I think it's such a attractive word. I think it's slightly controversial word, happiness. You can get into debates what it means. You know, it's presenting to a new client, and they definitely had a naysayer there who wanted to ask me lots of questions around, you know, why happiness wasn't the right measure and why it wasn't, you know, and I can answer them. I don't know whether I convinced him, but at least people heard me answer his questions. So I think that some people instinctively think, oh, you know, happiness, that's happy clappy, it's dull, it's not intelligent. The reality is that if you look at that array of positive emotions, most of them are linked to using your full intelligence. Just a couple aren't. So if you're in a group setting and you're sort of laughing and joking together, we tend to descale our cognitive capacity a little bit, you know, as we switch it off because we're wanting to belong to the group in that moment. So there are elements of happiness which are sort of like where you give up some of your personal autonomy or intelligence, but they're small elements, and actually they're sometimes they're useful because they're creating bonding, but they're not the whole of it for sure, because you've got curiosity, interest, all those other things in there too. So yeah. I don't object to job satisfaction data, by the way. It's robust.
There's one final question from Charlie in the Q&A. Do you want to answer that?
Oh, right, I got it. Yeah, click another button. How might you approach happiness with OKRs without lazily using the 5 ways as QI? So OKRs, yeah, they're like KPIs, aren't they? But they're slightly different, Charlie. I think you use them more than I do. You might have to type me exactly what they are, but we do create a happiness KPI, which is our 0 to 100 thing for the happiness. So we talk about that a lot. And I think that if I was, you know, I've often said that I think that most businesses have got really poor people metrics. They're basically what we call lagging indicators. They're looking back at what's happened. So their staff turnover, absenteeism rates, even if it's engagement survey, it's what happened 2 months ago. So whereas it's very immediate happiness KPI, it's also predictive of what's going forward. So I certainly think that if you're going to have one KPI for your people that goes up to board level, should be happiness. But I mean, that's what I think. But I'm obviously going to think that. But I mean, I think it's so much better a measure than engagement. That's what this whole webinar has really been about. And I believe that wholeheartedly as a statistician. I think it's much more inclusive. It includes more people. Everyone can understand it. It's got great timelines, which is really important. And it moves compared to things. You can see what affects it. Like in that YouGov data, you could see the Ukraine war negatively affecting the happiness of the population. You know, you can see when the sun comes out, it positive. It is malleable as an indicator. It's not just going to be fixed, and that's very, very important because you want to be able to change things and change them positively. So happiness KPIs be balanced for that.
Brilliant. Thank you so much. And thank you everyone for staying online with us to hear those answers to those questions. We will be sharing a recording of this with everyone. And if you have further questions, you can always get in touch with us. But thank you again for everyone for joining us online. And thank you so much, Nic, for your insights. That's okay. And if you want to chat further, find me on LinkedIn. I accept connection requests. Thank you very much indeed. Bye-bye. Bye.